I would now like to continue to the second part of this seminar. And this is more about theory of provenance marks. Well, not only theory. I hope we will be seeing also many nice provenance marks. And I can say this because I saw the beginning of the presentation of David Pearson. And he will start with his talk about reflections on the study of provenance. And David Pearson retired in 2017 as Director of Culture, Heritage and Libraries for the City of London. And now he is a research fellow at the Institute of English Studies. But that's not the only thing. He is also teaching in the London Rare Book School. He's a senior member of Darwin College in Cambridge, and he teaches at the London Rare Book School. So, and most important, he also wrote a beautiful book about provenance research in book history, which is really a kind of founding study on provenance research. So I look forward to your lecture, Professor Pearson. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me and see the slides. And thank you very much for the kind words. I mean, I too would like to thank CERL for the invitation to take part in this. CERL has been such a leading light in everything to do with provenance studies for so long and continues to be. And its contribution to the whole field is obviously hugely important. I'd also like to salute poor old Fabiano if he's for participating in this, if he's suffering from COVID, which I'm very sorry to hear about. I hope he's going to get better very soon. Anyhow, I thought I would start. I was asked to give some thoughts and reflections on provenance and the study of provenance. I thought I'd try and jump to the discussion question that's been posed at the end of this session, which is, what is provenance in book history? And to my mind, it is every kind of evidence around the ownership and the use of books. It's all the primary evidence of all the kinds of markings that we find people leaving in their books, their ownership inscriptions, their booklets, their book labels, their stamps, their stencils, all of those primary and obvious kinds of evidences that people have left in books. And it may be subtler evidence than a name written on the title page. It may be things like Isaac Newton's famous dog ears, where he turns down the pages of his books and you can tell that a book's been through Newton's hands because of the way that the pages are folded down sometimes. Or it may be very cryptic or hard to decipher evidence that people have left because they used monograms or initials or whatever. It's all part of that collective field of provenance evidence, and it's all the secondary evidence as well, besides what we actually find left in books for us. It's all the secondary evidence of books which have once been owned, which we may no longer be able to find on library shelves, but which are recorded in library lists, in sale catalogues, in probate inventories, all of those kinds of things. So there's this huge amount of that secondary evidence, as I call it, out there, as well as what survives there in the books. And it's important. All of this stuff is important because it tells us what we want to know about historic books, or what I think we want to know or should want to know about historic books. It shows how they have been used and how they've been read, how they've been regarded in previous generations. It shows us what influence or otherwise they have had. It gives us a direct interface into that world between the users and the owners of the books and the authors and the texts. And, if anything, gives us insights into the social impact of books, which I always think is the the one-line description of the history of the book. You know, what is book history about? It's about understanding the social impact of books, it seems to me, and provenance evidence is what gives us the windows into that world. I think I'm already preaching to the converted, though, by saying all of these kinds of things at an event like this, and it's probably better if I use my time here with some thoughts about where we go from where we are now, rather than just talking about what's there and celebrating it all. A couple of years ago, I produced a revised edition of that book of mine, which first appeared in 1994. So a new edition came out 25 years after the original one. And redoing the book was a great opportunity to see how the field had developed, what had changed, how things had evolved during that quarter century period. And the answer was they have evolved and developed hugely and very encouragingly. It was really great to see just how many new publications around the ownership and use of books and around private libraries have appeared during recent decades, and to see how library catalogues, as well as book dealers and auctioneers' catalogues, have changed and evolved during that period, how typical it now is to find an awful lot more attention given to provenance and the former ownership of books than would have been the case some decades ago. Today, I think, certainly in most libraries dealing with historic books in the Anglo-American and European worlds, it's standard practice to record former ownership when cataloguing any kinds of historic books, and to make that information discoverable in a way that it really wasn't in 1990, or was in a much more patchy kind of way. So there is a huge amount of data now out there in online library catalogues and other online resources that allows us to find out about the former ownership, about the provenance of books, records of provenance markings, images of provenance markings. An awful lot more information is available to us than was the case 20, 30 years ago, which is all wonderful. But we do still, I think, have quite a long way to go. And I think there are several fronts where we do need to keep working. Although quite a lot of smaller or medium-sized historic libraries have been able to recatalogue their books, to go back through their collections and systematically record the provenance and the former ownership of the books, there are a lot of larger libraries where that isn't the case, or where they have been recording provenance evidence perhaps for the last 20 years or so, but there's a huge backlog. There's a huge part of the iceberg underneath the waterline where that just isn't the case still, and they don't have the resources to go back and recatalogue and redo the information. So if you want to find out about the former ownership of the books in the British Library or in the Bodleian Library or in most big national major research libraries, you will probably find some information for some books on the catalogue, but the great majority of their holdings won't be covered in that way, and the library catalogues still don't allow you to find that out. There is an awful lot of ground still to be covered. And we don't, on the whole, have any really good joined up interfaces to the databases that we've got that allow you to search a lot of this data at one go very simply. I mean, there are no silver bullets out there that allow you to search the provenance information of the world's libraries at one go. Our union catalogues have not been very good at that. ESTC, the English Short Title Catalogue, for many years didn't ingest provenance data. OCLC has never taken an interest in provenance and copy-specific information. The technology exists to make these kinds of things possible. The new JISC Discovery Hub in this country is beginning to make that possible in a way that it wasn't in the past, but there's still a long way to go. There are still an awful lot of islands of information out there which are not joined up and which you can't search very simply all in one go. Library catalogues are dependent on the software that they run on, and some librarians, I think, still report problems about the capacities of their systems, either to take in provenance data in a proper structured way, or perhaps more commonly, to make it searchable and discoverable, because the people who design these systems still tend to think that authors and titles are what people want to know about what's in libraries, and that really is the end of it. And these systems are still not as hospitable to copy-specific data and making it as discoverable as authors and titles are, as could be the case. And that relates obviously to wider issues around the perception of books and what is interesting and what is important about them. I said earlier that I was preaching to the converted, and I'm sure that everybody who is tuned in here doesn't need to be convinced of the value of provenance data and of recording it and interpreting it and understanding it and all of those kinds of things. But I think there's still a perception in the population at large that what matters about books is texts and authors, and all the rest is kind of peripheral. And I think it's important that we all become evangelists to help to turn that mindset around, and encourage the world to recognize what value there is in these individual histories of books, rather than just in the authors and the titles. And that's reflected not only in library catalogues, but also in libraries' collection development policies. I think there are still a lot of libraries, certainly in the English-speaking world, who have collection development policies which are built very much around authors and texts, and they don't, they won't buy what they consider to be a duplicate. If a library is offered a copy of a book which has a really interesting and relevant provenance for them, but the author and the text is one that's already held in the library, they'll say, well, we don't want that. It's a duplicate. We don't collect duplicates. And I think turning that mindset around is also quite an important front on which we need to move. I think it's increasingly important, all of this stuff, also because as the world goes more and more digital, and I think the events of the last 18 months, the pandemic, have certainly encouraged that digital online shift in the world on so many fronts. As more and more the mindset sets in that, if we want to access a book, well, you can do it online. The physical originals are more and more threatened for their long-term survival, and ensuring that there is a broadly understood mindset that there is so much more to books than just the words on the pages, that the individual histories of the books are really important historical evidence, are part of our documentary heritage. It's really important to get that message across. We also need to increase and improve the resources that we make available for people to help to identify and interpret the provenance that they discover in books. Particularly developing our online resources. This is obviously an area where CERL has, for many years, as I said at the beginning, been a really important player. And I think not only the mounting of the databases, and most obviously the MEI database and the provenance sub-database following on from that, but the CERL pages that give signposts to online resources across the countries of the world that are relevant to and useful for provenance research. They are really useful and really important, and I hope that CERL will long continue to develop them and to enhance them. But there have been various projects, various initiatives in recent years devoted to creating online resources which are dedicated to help with provenance work, provenance research and identification and interpretation. Whether it's things like the online database of armorial book bindings, whether it's the listings that private libraries in Renaissance England have been putting up, whether it's collections of examples like Provenance Online, etc. There's a growing number of these kinds of things. My own contribution to that growing area is Book Owners Online, which we launched last year, where we're trying to create a freely available online directory of historic book owners, focusing on British book owners. At the moment, its content, there are about 2,000 entries on it that relate to British book owners of the 17th and early 18th centuries. It has a very long way to go before it can develop the kind of critical mass to make it really useful to a lot of people. But I believe it has at least developed a proof of concept and shown how something can be done, which starts with book owners as its backbone, as its spine, rather than starting with a particular collection of books or a particular library, which a lot of these kinds of resources do. But I think one of the things that we do need to think about going forward is how best to work collectively across all of these various projects, which, as I say, are growing all the time, so that wheels are not reinvented, so that people don't do too much of the same things. If we can work out ways of joining some of these things together in a way that is more useful to more people, without stifling individual initiatives or without discouraging any particular innovation, then I think that's a good thing, and is obviously an area that we need to think about. So I think there are plenty of things for us to think about going forwards. As I said, an awful lot of very encouraging work has been done relating to provenance and supporting provenance study in recent decades. And I hope we can all continue to work together to take this forward. And I think the CERL Working Group is an obvious hub, an obvious place where a lot of that work can be done and a lot of it can be brought together. So that was what I wanted to say, and I hope that made sense, and I hope I haven't trodden on Christina's toes with what she's going to say next, but she's probably going to say something completely different.
Well, thank you, David. And the things you said can't be repeated too much. So if Cristina says the same, we will all will hear it again. And yeah, I think the most important people who need to hear this are the managers of libraries, because, like you may know, all the people working with the books, they are convinced of what you say, but there needs people in the board of the libraries need to be convinced too, but maybe CERL can also play a role in that. Well, let's go to Cristina. Cristina Dondi. She is professor at Lincoln College in Oxford, and she's a very active member of CERL. You all heard about the material evidence in Incunabula database and the owners of Incunabula. She also had the 15th century book trade project and a beautiful exhibition on Incunabula in Venice. And Cristina works a lot with provenance. So Cristina, we are looking forward to hearing your talk about provenance marks. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marieke, and greetings to you all. Obviously, what I'm going to say is complementary, and because it is inevitable when these thoughts and consideration of research comes from people who actually works hands-on books. So what I'm going to say also will resonate with Fabio Cataldo's paper, and indeed with dispersal of collections in general. Let me start by sharing my screen. Okay. And to make sure that I would not repeat myself or anything, especially after a talk from David Pearson, I written my paper today, and I will now start reading it. So, based on many years of work on manuscript first, then on Incunabula, I would simply define provenance in book history as the reconstruction of the life of a book, from the time and place where it was written and printed to the time it entered the current location. If we are dealing with a historical copy, we trace the history of the book to the time and place where it was last recorded. The implications and application of a definition conceptually so simple are, of course, vast. I was recently asked to prepare a paper on the history of the book, and after some time unraveling the different approaches of the Anglo-American School of Analytical Bibliography versus the French socio-economic approach opened up by Febvre and Martin, L'apparition du livre, I concluded by observing that we pose ourselves questions, identify the evidence necessary to answer the question, and the methodology to gather and process that evidence efficiently and effectively. The combination of sources, documentary, bibliographical, material, is essential in this research. As Don Mackenzie had advocated, use all relevant evidence, and as any serious historian would do, whatever it takes, in the memorable words of Mario Draghi. We elaborated on the necessity to use a combination of sources in the 2017 conference held at the British Library, which concluded Laura Carnelo's successful Marie Curie research project, Patrimonit, from cheap print to rare ephemera, dispersal and survival of the 16th century Italian book patrimony outside Italy. So briefly outlined, internal evidence, and this would correspond to David's primary evidence, can be textual, such as the liturgical use and saints in a calendar, then include decoration, binding, ownership marks, marginal annotations, sale marks. Evidence external to the book, what David called secondary evidence, is found in historical library catalogs, in documentary evidence such as the British Library internal reports, which Carnelos used so effectively, or confiscation lists, which we have seen or probably touched upon from Eustace's paper. And in bibliographical evidence, such as booksellers and auctions catalogs, and the grand bibliographical studies, especially those of the past centuries. But because books are mobile and sociable objects, which in their lives move in and out of book collections and libraries, I thought it was essential to develop a methodology of work which captured their mobility over time from the book's perspective, as well as their presence in libraries. The database Material Evidence in Incunabulas does exactly that. We track the mobility of books by tracking, locating, and dating their former owners over time. Let me give you a brief example for those of you who are not familiar with MEI. This is an edition of Cicero, printed in Venice in 71, today in the Bodleian Library. The first ownership evidence comes from a note below the colophon, where Renoberto de Campo, from Dole in France, purchased the book in Milan at the price of 3 ducats and 9 soldi in 72. This evidence actually tells us that in 1 year, the book was shipped from Venice to Milan, where it was put on sale and was purchased by a French person. The entry, so this evidence is so represented in MEI. From Venice 71, which is the bibliographical information from ISTC, we pass to the first block of provenance, which is Milan, 1472. And then the book moves to Dole in 1472 still, purchased by Renoberto de Campo. You will see here there is the link to the PDA where we have the picture which I just showed you. And then there is a second owner, Jacobus Benedictus, a Carmelite from Chalon-sur-Marne, who purchased the book there in 79. So, of course, the third block of provenance is the book moving from Dole to Chalon-sur-Saône. And then again, another inscription tells us that finally the book is given as a gift to the well-known master of the Carmelites, Lorenzo Burello. And in fact, the coat of arms that you see at the bottom is Burello's coat of arms, which means that the book was decorated quite a few years later. And the same you can recognize for the style in the decoration. So Dole, Chalon-sur-Saône, Dijon, where the book must have stayed probably until the secularization of the religious orders in France, because the next evidence is an appearance in the catalogue of the Duc de la Vallière in 1783, and from there moved to Amsterdam, Bolongaro, Crevenna, then to Oxford, finally purchased at the Crevenna sale. So here we have alternating evidence, which is material, and then also bibliographical. We also created a visualization of the movement of the books. This doesn't work any longer. We are working with King's College in London for a new visualization based on geographical maps, and hopefully you'll hear more about it. So back to my presentation. The spin-offs resources, which are based on the same data model as MEI and applied to books printed after 1500, from Patrimonit, that you see again at the top, our prototype, to MathMed readers, to the Book of Books on the Library of Fernando Colón, not yet visible to the public, to our latest creation, HPB Provenance, accommodated the recording and retrieval of evidence of various kinds, which can be uploaded to CERL's Provenance Digital. Sorry, here is the HPV Provenance, and here is the Provenance Digital Archive of CERL, so that each record is completely self-evident. Information on the owners of books, private or institutional, or even anonymous but localizable, is gathered in Owners of Incunabula and other printed books. These new additions will come soon because it reflects its content. As we converge data on book ownership coming from all over the world and recorded in databases with the same data model, we reconstruct dispersed libraries. For example, I'm showing the entry for Maffeo Pinelli, the last state printer of Venice. The arrow indicates that his collection contained incunabula, of which 170 editions are recorded in MEI, mostly today in the Bodleian Library, but also scattered around the world in Cambridge, Athens, Washington, Lugano, Bergamo, and so on. Pinelli's library also contains post-incunabula, some of which are recorded in the Patrimonit database. In the database Owners of Incunabula and other printed books, we are in the process of reconstructing over 20,000 libraries. Provenance research is also the only means by which we can assess book survival and its corollary, book disposal and destruction. Book survival was very much at the center of a conference that I organized back in 2012, together with the colleagues Richard Sharp, Professor of Diplomatic at Oxford, and Dorit Rines, who teaches History of Libraries and Archives at Venice Ca' Foscari. Its title was How the Secularization of Religious Houses Transformed the Libraries of Europe from the 16th to the 19th century. And this one resonates exactly with Fabiano's paper. The volume will finally be published at the end of this year. In it, we specifically look at the impact of religious, political, and economic factors and events on the preservation, destruction, and repurposing of the European book heritage. Events such as the Reformation and the suppression of religious institutions by Napoleon, Joseph II, and the national governments of the 19th century. In the final chapter, we explain how digital resources such as MEI, but there are others, are allowing us to reconstruct dispersed collections of the past, and therefore, the spread of knowledge which those collections embodied. We also begin to understand institutional trends towards our book heritage over the centuries. Well aware of the need for the historian to capture the evidence of the impact of the secularizations on the migration of books and the formation of libraries, MEI introduced the option institutional transfer among the methods of acquisition field, which distinguishes also purchases, donations, bequests, exchanges, dedications, copies, requisitions and thefts, and restitutions. An advanced search, which you can see here in the field, returns over 4,400 editions in over 7,000 copies, which entered collections because of institutional transfer. Basically, 10% of the copies present today in MEI. This is a very good start, but a fraction of the real amount of books displaced following governmental directives and still surviving today. Large questions may require a lot of evidence and the collaboration of many people over a long time. My own ongoing project on the impact of the European printing revolution is a case in point. The 15th Century Book Trade project, funded by the European Research Council, was set up for this purpose, as there are still 500,000 incunabula around the world. But there is no scope in trying to find shortcuts. The work just needs to be done. In a 1980 seminal paper, What is the History of the Books, Robert Darnton concluded by saying that by its very nature, the history of books must be international in scale and interdisciplinary in method. I should just add interdisciplinary and collaborative in method. The way we go about working on provenance and the tools we use ultimately will determine the success of our ability to answer important historical questions. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Cristina, for this very inspiring lecture, and it also connects to the words of Fabiano Cataldo and to the words of Justus Duren and David Pearson. We are here all together and we want to hear about collaboration. So thank you very much, and also for the showing of what can be done with all this research. And I would now like to invite, we can start a discussion, and I would like to invite people to post questions in the chat, if there are any. And well, meanwhile, maybe I have to talk to say something, but it's really very inspiring to hear all those lectures and see how much has been done and can be done and will be done. And we are developing tools for collaboration. And like David Pearson showed us, CERL is in the middle of many developments. And I do hope that the collaboration will be international. Like Justus Duren said, there are many local initiatives, and you can also see at the CERL Provenance page that there are many dispersed databases, but we should find a manner to connect them all. And there's a question from Eric Schroeder to both David and Cristina. What is the most important thing that CERL could do? So could I hear your view on this? David.
Well, I mean, maybe I'll come to that question kind of circuitously by saying that the thing that I was thinking as Cristina was talking was one of the great challenges, I think, for all of us who are working in this field and who are trying to build resources in this area. One of the challenges is developing critical mass. I mean, what none of us are able to do or produce at the moment is back in the day, IFLA used to talk about universal bibliographic control. It used to talk about the dream of having a centralized resource where you could find out about every book anywhere in the world. And OCLC would say, well, we've kind of done that with WorldCat, which, up to a point they have.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I think WorldCat is more advanced in its terms than anything that we've got relating to provenance and former ownership. And what any of the catalogers who are here this afternoon, I think, will say is, these resources are all very well, but what we want, when we're cataloging a book, and we've got an inscription or a book plate or some kind of provenance evidence in front of us, we want to be able to go to a place, an online resource that will tell us what that is, that will help us to identify it. And I was in Salisbury Cathedral Library yesterday, and that is precisely what the cataloger there said to me. And it's what anybody will say. And the challenge, I think, for all of these various database and online projects, which we're all severally working on at the moment, is that they're still so far away from being that kind of one-stop shop. I think the biggest challenge to all of us collectively is to find a way of working towards that, which perhaps does sound like a pipe dream, but 100 years ago, you would have said the same about the discovery of historic books. 100 years ago, if you wanted to know what books were printed in the 17th century and where you would find copies of them, the resources were very patchy. Today, the landscape is transformed through the huge short title catalogue and union catalogue projects. It's kind of being done. Mm-hmm. So the technology exists, but actually making it happen is still a huge mountain to climb. So coming back to Eric's question, I guess what's the most important thing that CERL could do? Maybe help help to facilitate some kind of bringing together mechanism. I don't know if the CERL's got the resources to do that, but there are already quite a lot of online resources out there through what's in the CERL's various databases, through Book Owners Online, through the Provenance Online project, through the Armorials database, through private libraries in Renaissance England, there's a whole, and legacy libraries over in America. There's a whole host of these things. We need to find a way of joining them up a bit more. And then when you've solved that problem, if you can then go on and do a one-stop shop for the library catalogues of the world, so that you can do a one-stop shop on searching copy-specific data.
David,
I think that would be great. Sorry, that was too long.
David, may I say that this is exactly what we envisage to do with the CERL PDA, but it all depends on collaboration. But we designed it that people can search, for example, with icon class or with keywords for a certain provenance mark, and they can find who was this former owner. And I agree with you, it's only one international collection, and we should be able to find a means to connect other provenance databases. But the CERL PDA, it all depends also on collaboration, like Cristina told in her lecture, and maybe you can elaborate this further, Cristina, from CERL's point of view.
Yeah. Well, I think fostering the integration of digital resources and the collaboration of people involved in them or even contributing to is and has been always CERL's objective and strength. And of course, there are different scales of challenges. So in Cunabula, only 500,000 data has been carefully curated for longer, and we are very advanced in what we can do with the copy-specific. NEI itself has reached 60,000 records, over 500 libraries contributing, over almost 300 people contributing. So it's going, it's on the right track for continuing on that. Post-incunabula, of course, it's a totally different number that we're talking about. I would like to remind, though, that good progress is happening with the Heritage Printed Book Database, simply because as HPB brings together the records of the libraries of Europe and the US for the books printed before around 1850, as those libraries individually start adding the copy specific on their records and then send to CERL the records to be uploaded in HPB, it's not deleted them. They are there. And so that means that as time goes past, the good quality cataloging, of course, has to be done generally at base level, in the libraries. But as they share that data internationally, we will be able to use HPB also as a discovery for the copy specific. That means that we will be able to develop more refined searches, even though, remember, there are many things that help already, like the application of the CERL thesaurus for the searches of HPB. There are challenges in the way the bibliographical records are presented, simply because there are so many. And CERL is now investing a lot in trying to cluster the presentation of the bibliographical records, so then the user can better navigate that material. And then if, as we think we do need, have to start thinking about the equivalent of a portal for provenance research, like CERL in a very visionary way 20 years ago tried to do the portal for manuscript studies and integrate search through our manuscripts. And I think we will all be very ready to have these discussions because, of course, it's necessary. And but the portal for the integrated access to manuscript collections and manuscript and printed collection together ultimately did not succeed. We were ahead of time, and the basic data coming from the libraries themselves were either not structured enough, or the technology was more challenging. So there is every hope that we will be able, as David said, to do some clever integration of the data. But as he also said, it's vital that there are more helping tools in the identification of the good catalogers and scholars working more and more book in hands, so that they actually get it right or get the help they need in identifying the vital provenance information. Totally.
Yes, and there I see for CERL two very important strategies. The first is what you described, Cristina, collaboration. And the second one is developing the CERL PDA further, so that this may become a tool for identification of provenance marks. And we also had a very important question for this discussion, and David touched upon it in the beginning. What is a mark of provenance? And if I understood you right, everything in a book is a mark of provenance. So, and I think this goes together with Cristina's opinion, and we wanted to discuss this, Agnieszka and I, because of the CERL PDA. Should every mark of provenance be described in the CERL PDA? For example, the folding of the pages of, who was it? is this a kind of provenance mark that we should describe? And we can't describe every time it occurs, but you could make a general description. When you see a page folded like this, think that this book can have been in the hands of, who was it? I don't remember. Of Newton. So all these marks should be described in the CERL PDA. The two of you agree upon that? Or the four of you? Or the 99 of us?
I agree. If it's useful, and I think it's something visible that the only great scholarly knowledge and handling of this kind of books is able to share, like in the example that David gave, I think that's a vital piece of information for somebody else.
Mm. Mm.
Out of my research, I've 6 years ago, my very first project in Vienna was a office library, 80,000 pieces, and we had no idea where should we start. And I became the hint to type down every single pictogram, every single handwritten, every detail, and we haven't had any idea of the history of this library, which started in 1855 and had a new catalog in 1941 with no information of all the provenances. And with all the marks, I had the chance to sorted them after my examination in groups and to get out of this a history of this library, which grew in the Second World War by 200%, but we had no information, and with collecting all these information, all these tiny handwritten marks by book dealers and so on, I had the chance to get those groups by sorting them and to get to know each other, to get to know more about this whole collection, the whole history of this library.
Well, that's very interesting. So this should be the work that should be done before describing the individual marks. There is a question in the chat: how does one persuade the manager to finance it? And I think this is also something where CERL can play an important role, because we all know that there is less money for culture, and many libraries have less people that work with the books themselves, and they need to catalog, and provenance cataloging is very time consuming. So I think this is a very important point that CERL can take with them. And there's also a remark: provenance research is underway for Asian and Near Eastern books. How can we find out about it, and could it be included in CERL's coverage? Cristina.
Yeah.
This one's for you.
Yes. In fact, at the conference I mentioned on the history of the history of the book, there was a wonderful presentation by Mercedes Garcia Arenal from Madrid, and she runs, together with some other colleagues, a European Research Council synergy grant on the dissemination of the Quran in Europe, and starting from the Middle Ages to the late modern period, production, translations, use, etc. So I think that's an excellent example. I understand they are compiling a sort of database, I'm going to have further discussion with her. We were in agreement on many points, as this project is also hands-on. And I think it would be very important to bring results into the HPB, for example, that is not only kept separate, but is shared. Many of the books that are working on probably are already in European libraries, not necessarily cataloged if they are in more exotic languages. So there is certainly a discussion to be done there. What is more important is that now there are large projects based on cataloging who are working on these collections. Well, and there are more.
Okay.
Yeah.
In the chat, there's a link to the Staatsbibliothek of Berlin, and that might be important for the subject of Asia and Near Eastern material.
Right.
But I understood it also as that people are working in Asia on provenance research, and how do we connect with them? We now have a connection with Latin America via Fabiano Cataldo, and we have connections with North America, but there should also be connections with Asia, I suppose this participant suggests. Are there any other questions? Cristina.
May I just say briefly on the question of Karen Attar about how do we convince the managers? I think it's a combination of approaches, working very closely with the scholars who are working with books, and particularly the younger scholars who are now getting their projects funded based on book history. So somebody must go through in certain directions because more projects are funded that are based on book history. So then if these scholars are closely working with libraries, then it will be easier for the libraries and for organizations like CERL to prove how vital it is that the material is well cataloged and that the material catalog is used for scholarly purposes. Second, outreach. Make sure that whatever scholarship is done based on our book heritage, it's delivered not only to scholarship, but also in some form to the larger public. This is something that is what we try to do with the Venice exhibition, which actually was a success. Yes. And by the way, I can say that that exhibition will most likely be opening in Buenos Aires next year. And Fabiano knows about it, and the organization is progressing. But also, I would like briefly to mention the present CERL project funded by the Polonsky Foundation about illustrated census of all the Dante edition of the Commedia with illustration by Botticelli. That was an exercise that we coordinated, and it involved 135 libraries around the world. And that included Japan and Brazil. Fabiano found a copy for us, and Belarus, and many other more obvious places. We are creating videos to share the results with the public, and already the individual libraries who work with us, even not member of CERL, took that opportunity to look more at their books, digitize them, doing blogs, doing an article. And so I think there is a strong role of CERL for actually doing interesting projects for scholarly purposes and the general public, which involve many of our libraries. Okay. And I think that is a good message for the administrators.
Well, thank you, Cristina. And to follow up, Marianne Lefferts posted in the chat that CERL is planning to write a type of manifest to be in use for conversation with managers and to help you to make the case for special collections. And I think that's very important as well, and the value for your institution. So if you look in the chat, you can see the message of Marianne, and if you want to co-write or to offer input, then you can send her an email. And then there's a video on YouTube about the DENT project, also the link in the chat. And the program for the Berlin workshop looks excellent with a wide applicability. Thank you, Laura, and hi from Mauritius. So I think there's a lot of information in the chat as well. So before we close this meeting, we should make sure that we keep all the information in the chat. Marian, I don't know how, but I'm sure you know how, or don't close it too soon. It's now almost 5:30, at least here in the Netherlands. There's also a big movement in Argentina. Well, I think we can conclude that a lot of work is done at the moment around the world. And I think the most important word that I heard today is collaboration. And with collaboration, you can create the critical masses that David speaks about, and Fabiano told us, and Cristina showed the how do you call it? The importance of collaboration with all her projects, where so many people work together and indeed create a critical mass. So I think we all should take this word with us, collaboration, and don't forget that CERL is an organization where collaboration is very important. So if there are no other questions, I would like to thank you very much for your participation, and I hope to see you at the next Provenance seminar of the Provenance Working Group of CERL, and that will be held in April. And if one of you thinks, well, I could give an important lecture or an interesting lecture or whatever, please contact CERL, and maybe you can be one of the speakers at the next seminar. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.